Spirit, however, has shown itself to us to be neither merely the withdrawal of self-consciousness into its pure inwardness, nor the mere submergence of self-consciousness into substance and the non-being of its moment of difference. But spirit is this movement of the self, which empties itself of itself and sinks into its substance. And also, as subject has gone out of that substance into itself, making the substance into an object and a content at the same time as it cancels this difference between objectivity and content. That first reflection out of immediacy is the subject's differentiation of itself from its substance, or the notion's separation of itself from itself, the withdrawal into itself, and the becoming of the pure I. Since this difference is the pure act of I equals I, the notion is the necessity and the uprising of existence, which has substance for its essence and subsists on its own account. But this subsistence of existence on its own account is the notion posited indeterminateness, and is thus also its immanent movement, that of going down into the simple substance, which is subject only as this negativity and movement. The I has neither to cling to itself in the form of self-consciousness as against the form of substantiality and objectivity, as if it were afraid of the externalization of itself. The power of spirit lies rather in remaining the selfsame spirit in its externalization, and as that which is both in itself and for itself, and making its being for itself, no less merely a moment than it's in itself. Nor is spirit a tertium quid that casts the differences back into the abyss of the absolute and declares that therein they are all the same. On the contrary, knowing is this seeming inactivity which merely contemplates how what is differentiated spontaneously moves in its own self and returns into its unity. Paragraph 804 is a little bit shorter than the massive paragraph 803 that just came before it, but there's a lot going on there. And as we're approaching the end of absolute knowing, we're really grappling with a central question that this one is posing for us, raising, getting us to ask, what is it, or how is it that spirit knows what it knows in absolute knowing? We should think, well, what is absolute knowing? And I do want to point out something that echoes the paragraph right before it, which I didn't talk about quite as much in that because there was so much to go over. Towards the end, he's going to say, spirit is not a tertium quid, a third, right, that casts the differences, and differences is an important term here that we'll come back to in a moment, back into the abyss, the Abgrund, right, of the absolute. And so we saw that formulation just earlier in the previous paragraph. Why talk about an abyss? So what is an abyss? An abyss, and this is very nicely built into the German term here, Abgrund, right? So Grund is a foundation, and then Ab is from, away from, right? And it's something that doesn't have a foundation, something that opens up a chasm before you. Like in old movies where they would take like a rock or something and drop it and then listen. Do I hear it hit the ground? And they would, after a while, come back up and say, I didn't hear anything, right? So you can't find a basis. You can't find a ground. And this notion of abyss, it's where things that are too, let's say, too vague, too underdeveloped, go and disappear. If we're talking about the absolute. So the question here is, well, how do we approach the absolute? Something that Hegel is evidently very interested in, and I think readers of Hegel, both then and now, are also quite interested in. And when we think about the absolute, we're thinking about like what encompasses everything. So if the absolute itself were to be an abyss, well, then we've got problems there. And there's really, two different ways that come to mind where the absolute could be an abyss. One of them is, the sort of vague talk about the absolute that we see in other people of the time. And Hegel doesn't really like this. Hegel thinks that is, to go back to something in the preface, a night when all cows are black. You don't learn anything. There's no knowing going on there. Knowing, wissen, has to be something that is at the same time differentiated and unified. It can't just be some mystical experience of the absolute or something like that. There's another way in which the absolute could also be an Abgrund and an abyss, right? And that would be if there really isn't any absolute, if it's all just, perception or perspective, if we're going to like veer off into something that we typically later on will call nihilism. Now that's a term that's actually around in Hegel's time but not being used very much. Interestingly, Jacobi, who is the person that we think is the first author to use it, is targeting the idealistic philosophy, particularly that of Kant. And, maybe this carries through to Hegel. We could ask this very important question that Hegel thinks he's got answered. If we don't have some sort of epistemological closure point in absolute knowing, does it all fall apart? Now, personally, I don't think it does. I don't think that Hegel managed to bring off the project that he was trying to do. Obviously, history didn't end with Hegel publishing the Phenomenology of Spirit, right? There's plenty to go on after that, but he seemed to think that was quite important. We talked about this in the preface, right? All right, so that's all kind of preceding matters. And I did bring up this issue of differences. So there's a lot of terms here differentiating that are getting brought up here. And Unterschied is the key term in German, meaning to separate things off from each other, to distinguish them, to differentiate. Works just well. Difference, Unterschied. Keep that in mind as we're going through this as well. All right, so coming back to the beginning of it, he tells us, Spirit, now notice this. He's not saying Spirit isn't this, but is this. He's saying it's not just this, but also this. Spirit has shown itself to us, the phenomenologists, the people carrying this out, Hegel and us, his readers, to be neither merely, so it's not just the withdrawal, zurückziehen, of self-consciousness, Selbstbewusstsein, into pure inwardness, Innerlichkeit, right? So it's not just self-consciousness, we could say retreating or pulling itself, I like that with a ziehen, right? Pulling itself back into its pure interiority. So but it is also that is happening. That's part of the story here. Nor is it simply the submergence, the Versenkung. And Hegel's going to use this word, sinken here, to fall into, to settle into, to sink into, of self-consciousness, once again. Actually, it's der selbe. He doesn't say self-consciousness twice. Into substance. And here he says something really interesting. And again, this ties in with the Abgrund, the abyss thing. Nor the mere submergence of self-consciousness into substance and the non-being of its moment of difference. Now, the non-being here is not just a negation of being, sein, right? It's actually nicht sein. So, we could translate this as non-being, but, more literally, it's the nothingness of being or being nothingness. Nichts is nothing. So, submergence into substance, there's a kind of nothingness involved in this difference that is taking place. And we're going to look at that in just a moment. Then he goes on and he says, but spirit is this movement of the self, right? So the Selbst. And once again, as I've pointed out so many times, the 4 S's, spirit, self, substance, and subject. How are these related to each other? How are these connected to each other? Well, here we actually do get the answer. They're all spirit, right? Every one of them figures into what spirit is, and therefore what in absolute knowing it is knowing, which is in part a knowing of its own self, the self that is spirit, but also knowing ourselves as the selves that we are, and I hesitate to use this word part, but we could say this, parts or components or moments is another term that Hegel often uses, of spirit as self-consciousnesses, right? Okay, so let's look more closely at what this is. The movement, the Bewegung of the self, and what is the self doing? It empties itself. Well, yeah, externalizes itself and äußert, right? It goes outside of itself. Is that emptying itself? Sure, by implication, because if you're taking something out of one container over here and moving it somewhere else, like, you get a package of hot dogs because you're going to go to make yourself some hot dogs, and you open it up, and if it's Oscar Mayer, there's 5 hot dogs in there, and you undo the thing and you take them out, you put them on the plate because you're going to heat them up, maybe you're going to boil them or put them in the microwave. Okay, now that what was in that container is no longer in there, right? You've endoised it, you've externalized it from that. Okay, so this is a very spatial metaphor, but it works. And self is emptying itself into substance. And we saw this interplay between substance and subject being really highlighted in the previous paragraph. And, it's going to be implicit in the paragraphs yet to come, but here's where they're being brought together in an incredibly unified way. All right, so empties itself of itself and sinks, notice again, submergence, into its substance. But also as subject. So the self is substance. Every self is a substance. But it's also subject. And, if the self were merely substance, then it couldn't really be a self. It has to also be subject, capable of agency, capable of taking a position on itself, right? Being something that is for itself, as he's going to bring up a little bit later on. So as subject, it has gone out of that substance into itself. And now here we get the relation in the self between subject and substance. What is it? Well, on the side of substance, substance can be grasped here in 2 ways. And at first you might say, well, these are the same thing, right? Hegel's just engaging in a little bit of rhetoric where he says the same thing basically twice, but that's not what's going on as we follow through, right? Making the substance into an object, a Gegenstand, and a content, an Inhalt. Okay, substance could be a Gegenstand, that is something that is there for the self, that is there for the subject, present in a, objective way, we could say. But it's also content. Content of what? Content of the knowing, the thinking, the behavior, the Handeln, right, of the self. There's both a theoretical and practical side to this. Absolute knowing is not a pure, abstract, theoretical knowing. It is an all-encompassing knowing that embraces both the theoretical and the practical. Hegel goes on in the next sentence, and he tells us that it makes the substance into object and content at the same time as it cancels. Now, that's aufheben, right? It aufhebt this difference, Unterschied, right, between objectivity, Gegenständigkeit, and content, Inhalt. Now, is there an important difference here between object, Gegenstand, and objectivity, Gegenständigkeit? I don't think so. Maybe we could explore this more, but I tend to think that there he is actually just talking about being in the mode of an object and being in the mode of content. And there is a distinction between them. But at the same time, that distinction or that difference is being canceled, annulled, or perhaps brought to a higher level, right? So he says that first reflection out of immediacy, Unmittelbarkeit, right? So notice that he's using Reflexion again, as he did in the previous paragraph. Very important. There's a reflecting oneself, unfolding oneself into multiples out of immediacy, Unmittelbarkeit. Right? So no longer is it purely immediate, unmediated. Is the subject's differentiation of itself from its substance. So this, we've got self, subject, substance all connected together. And the subject is being, not just separated, but we could even say estranged from its substance, as we saw in the previous paragraph, a big important thing to be worked through. And now Hegel brings up the notion or the concept, the Begriff, which the entire phenomenology has been about exploring. Spirit comes to be understood and known in its fuller workings, in its development, its unfolding, its bringing to a fruition in the concept, the fully developed concept, in a conceptual way, which means the self not just relates itself to substance, but also understands itself through substance as a substance that is at the same time a subject. All right, so let's go on with this. So the notion's separation of itself from itself. There's actually three different things that are being mentioned here. Separation of itself from itself, not exactly what Hegel's saying here, but not totally wrong. Zeke Zenda. So Zeke, applying to itself, right? This is a reflexive verb. Zenda, zwei, two. And the ent, separating itself out into two. Separating itself from itself, yes, that works. Separating itself into two, bifurcating itself, we might even say. So that's one thing that's going on. Then we have withdrawal into itself. And this is not, zurückziehen. This is actually a term that we saw come up in the religion section quite a bit. In sich gehen, going into itself. Now, they both wind up in the same place, inside the self, right, in the self's interiority, but they're different locutions, we could say. So let's not mix them up completely. And then what else do we have? He says the becoming of the pure I, the becoming, the werden of this reine Ich, right? And the I that equals I that we've been talking about quite a bit in the previous paragraphs, and this has come up before in other sections as well. Notice that this equal sign, if it's Gleichheit, as we talked about before, doesn't always mean is identical with, right? Or can be interchanged with without any loss or addition of meaning, it's a little bit broader than that. There's a correspondence between the I and the I, which are both the same I, but are also, separated off from each other, right? And Zwein, right? So they've been distanced to some degree, but they've also been brought together. So he says that since this difference is the pure act, tat, right, the doing of I equals I does something or is what is done, here's where he says something really interesting. The notion, the concept, is the necessity, the Notwendigkeit. Now, remember back to the previous paragraph. We had a concern that maybe we're not actually grasping things in their necessity, but in pure accidentality or contingency, that we're not getting at the heart of the matter. Hegel is saying here that the notion is the necessity, and then he goes, the uprising that, coming into to being, we could say, of existence, of Dasein, coming into the world, into reality, into Wirklichkeit. To go backwards to the previous paragraph, something that got brought up and then didn't get elaborated more fully, actual history, right? Actual continuity and causal connections and contingency and necessity brought together. So, the concept at this point is providing existence with this. And he says, which has substance for its essence, right? And subsists. Now, subsists and substance, there's a temptation to link them together because they look very close in English, but it's bestehen as subsistence. Another mode of being, we could say. Has substance for its essence, subsists on its own account. This subsistence of essence on its own account is what? Something pure substance left by itself? No. It is the notion posited in determinateness, given Bestimmtheit. Now, the notion, we could think about how does the notion take on determinateness? Well, part of it is by unpacking what is distinctive to it, what makes it different than other notions at other points in time or development. But we can also think about the subject that is grasping conceptually the substance, different modes of understanding, of grasping, of desiring, of willing, of moving towards. Well, these are ways of introducing determinateness as well, right? Of determining, bestimmen, these matters. So this is a very rich idea that's being worked out here, or actually just referenced by Hegel, not really worked out. So posited in determinateness, he says, it's thus also its immanent movement, that of going down into the simple substance, which is subject only as this negativity and movement. Here's where we get to, once again, we could say the substance is in itself. What is the in itself? The in itself, in general, is that which has being, that which is there for the subject, the self-consciousness, but doesn't have a lot of agency or, intensive self-relation the way that the self and the subject do. The subject is for itself, right? It is a negativity of substance. Substance is not the total story. Now, things get more complicated because the self and the subject are also substances, but they're substances that are different than others by being for itself. I mean, here in this paragraph, you can see that Hegel, although he uses for itself and in itself and some other locutions in ways that you can't always pin down and say it's always this. This is very close to what Sartre is saying in Being and Nothingness, isn't it? About the in itself and for itself. All right, side note. Noted. Let's move back to this. So subject only has this negativity and movement. Then he says the I has neither to cling to itself in the form of self-consciousness as against the form of substantiality and objectivity, as if it were afraid of the externalization of itself. There's a sense in which, if you are externalizing yourself, you become vulnerable to all the other things within the world. That's why there's a temptation to, retreat to pure inwardness or to allow yourself to sink into a substance that doesn't have to think about itself. But at this point, the self doesn't have to have that anxiety or fear or aversion, right? It can actually be optimistic and hopeful. It doesn't have to cling to itself in the form of self-consciousness. It can be self-consciousness and at the same time not just self-consciousness, against the form of substantiality, being substance, and objectivity, Gegenständlichkeit once again. So he says here something very important. The power of spirit lies rather in remaining the self-same spirit in its externalization, and as that which is both in itself and for itself, in making its being for self no less merely a moment than it's in itself. So instead of prioritizing the for itself and saying, this is where my self-consciousness really lies, but I have to, by virtue of belonging to a world, to culture, of acting, I have to externalize myself into substance, and I lose something of myself in there. Hegel is saying if we properly understand ourselves and others as well as spirit, this at this point is not going to be the problem that we're making it out to be, because both the in itself and the for itself are moments. Neither of them have absolute priority within the absolute that we are already within and now mapping out, trying to understand, trying to wrap our head around conceptually for ourselves. So we have the kind of knowledge that spirit has, not just the knowledge that a individual self-consciousness has. So it remains the self-same spirit, right? Here's where he says, nor is spirit a tertium quid, third, literally, that casts the differences back into the abyss of the absolute and declares that they're all the same. It wants to retain these differences, these distinctions, these separating things out, and yet keep them united. And this is what conceptual thinking through the concept, is able to do for us. That's why we have to have moved beyond mere representation, Vorstellung, that we saw so elaborated in the religion section, and we need to move beyond inadequate philosophical points of view, philosophies of the understanding, as Hegel will later call them, that are not conceptual, but are also working with representations, and think in terms of concepts and the concept. So no, casting everything into some sort of, well, it's all the same, man. It's all one. None of that stuff for Hegel. Yes, in some sense, Hegel is a monist. It is all one spirit, right? But spirit is differentiated, very much so, richly variegated. It has to be understood in this richness and complexity and dynamic connections of these moments to each other. So he says, on the contrary, knowing is this seeming, not actual, seeming inactivity, which merely contemplates, merely looks on, how what is differentiated spontaneously moves in its own self and returns into its unity. Now, is it really that way? No. Things are actually much more subjectively intense in this way. Spirit is all of this, right? Through self-consciousness. Individual self-consciousness is the kind of self-consciousness that's reading Hegel's Phenomenology right now and thinking about this paragraph or explaining this paragraph to you. All of this is, something that we could think about as inactivity, not doing something, but there is some doing something going on here in the contemplation, in understanding these things, in knowing. Just to bring this to a close, we could say that wissen, knowing, is an active term for Hegel. It's not like we have, here's the sphere of action, practice, the real world over here, and then we have the idealistic world of contemplating our notions over here. No. They interpenetrate each other. Knowing things in the world, knowing ourselves, knowing others, knowing history, all of these knowings that are being rolled into absolute knowing are activities of the subject. Can they be turned into substance? Yes and no. We'll see how that works as we move on through. But you see that there's a lot of stuff being worked out and set out for us to work through in this relatively short paragraph, 804.